We'll begin this project by drawing some basic shapes, like rectangles, ellipses, and polygons. Shapes that we create in Illustrator are made up of anchor points, with paths connecting the anchor points. A square, for example, is made up of 4 anchor points on the corners, with paths connecting the anchor points. And this type of shape is referred to as a closed path. Now a path can be closed or it can be open with distinct anchor points at each end, which are called endpoints. So we'll first start our little project by making sure that we've selected artboard number 2. And I can just click on that artboard a couple of times to make sure that the black outline is showing, or I can also choose the artboard in the lower left-hand corner. So I just want to make sure that we are on the second artboard. And then I'm going to get my rectangle tool. You can just press M on your keyboard for a shortcut. And on the second artboard, I'll click, hold, and drag to create a rectangle. And I have my Smart Guides on, and so there's a measurement tooltip that appears. And I want to drag until the rectangle is about 0.5 inches wide and about 2 inches high. It can be a little tricky doing it this way, but we'll learn a different way to create shapes as well that is a little bit more precise. So when you've got a rectangle that is about that size, you can see the 4 anchor points that make up the object along with its paths. Now I can just move my cursor over that center blue dot, which we call the center point widget, and you can see that my cursor changes to a kind of a selection tool cursor, and I can just click, hold, and drag that shape around. And I'll end up dragging it towards the bottom half of the artboard. Now you can manipulate this shape by using these anchor points, kind of the bounding box. And so I'm just going to click on one of those sides on the bounding box and move it to the left to make it a little bit smaller, about 0.3 inches. We can also use the bounding box to rotate this object, and as I move my cursor towards one of the corners, you can see it change to a double arrow curve. So I'm going to click, hold, and start dragging, and I'm going to hold my Shift key down to constrain it to 45-degree angles. So now let's change the shape of this object a little bit. I'm going to zoom in so I can see better what I'm doing. I'll get my selection tool, and notice we can see these little widgets in the corners. That will change the radius of the corner. And I can just click any one of those corner widgets and drag in or out to change the radius of all 4 corners. So you can see how that changed all 4 corners. To get more precise measurements for the radius of the corners, I can open up the Transform panel. So I'll go to Windows and down to Transform. And we can see here that we've got an area where we can actually precisely indicate the radius of the corner. And I want to make sure that the link to those fields is working so that when I change one field, it will change all 4 corners. And I'm going to change the radius value to 0.125. And then I'll just press my Tab key, and then that changes all 4 corners. And we can see how that changes the radius on the rectangle. Now I want to change the radius of just 2 corners. So what I'm going to do is get my direct selection tool, and with the shape still selected, I'm going to double click the top left corner widget. And I can see a dialog box come up, and I'm just going to change the value of the radius to 0. And then I'll click OK. And now that changes it back to just a square. I'll do the same thing to the lower right corner. But this time, I'll just click, hold, and drag the corner radius widget out, because I just want to make it kind of a square corner on that one end. So I can just click, hold, and drag that one radius out from the center. And we can see that the little tooltip tells me it's 0. So that's another way of manipulating the corners. So I want to make sure this object is selected, so I'll get my selection tool and just drag around it. And then I want to open up the swatches panel. I want to change the color of this. I want to change it to some kind of dark red color. I want to make sure that my fill icon is forward in the swatches panel so that it changes the fill. I'll choose a dark red. And then I'll bring the stroke icon forward in the swatches panel to change that to none. All objects are created with a white fill and a black stroke as a default. So you can see that I want to bring that stroke icon forward and then click that little red diagonal line that says none, and that removes the stroke from the object. So I want to copy this now, so I'll go up to Edit and down to Copy, and then I'll go back to Edit and choose Paste in Front. And we're actually seeing 2 shapes, one on top of the other. The top shape is selected. So I'll hover my cursor over one of the corner control handles, hold down Shift, and drag it to the left to create a kind of an X like that. And now I'll change the fill color to a lighter shade of red. And I'll make sure that the fill box in the swatches panel is forward, and I'll just change it to a lighter red. And now I want to group this object, so I'll just use my selection tool to select both of these objects. And I'll go up to Object and Group. So there's our first part of our project, that little X. X marks the spot. So now we'll work with the rounded rectangle tool. I'll zoom out, I'll close these panels for now. And I'll get the rounded rectangle tool. I'll click and hold on the rectangle tool to bring up the other options and select the rounded rectangle tool. And then just to the right of that X, I'm going to click, hold, and drag a rectangle that is approximately 0.2 inches wide and 1.5 inches high. But I'm not going to release the mouse button yet because we want to make some changes. So I'm using my tooltip there in the lower right-hand corner to determine the size. can be a little tricky, so I'm moving it around just to make sure I get close to that size of 0.2 inches wide and 1.5 inches high. Okay, so what I accidentally did was release the mouse button, which I'm not supposed to do. So I can't go on. I'll have to delete that object there and draw another one that's 0.2 inches wide by 1.5 inches high and not release the mouse button. And while I still have the mouse button down, I can use my up and down arrow keys to change the radius of the corners. So you can see how the radius of the corners is changing as I move my mouse button, my up arrow key or my down arrow key. So I'm going to release that now, and then I'll open up the transform panel and put in some precise values for this. So I want a width value of 0.1 and a height value of 1 inch. And I want to make sure that constrain width and height properties is deselected, so it has a little diagonal line through that chain. So there I've changed the size of that object. And now I'm going to zoom in on this because we're going to change the corners a little bit. And with the selection tool, I'll drag any of the corner widgets towards the top of the shape until the measurement label shows a value of about 0.02 inches. And in the transform panel, we can change the way the corners look. So I'm going to click on one of those drop-down menus just for the top, left, and right corners and change it to chamfer for the type of corner radius. Oops, I deselected that accidentally. I want to select that object again, and there I'll just click that drop-down menu, and there are various corner types, and I want to choose chamfer for both the left and right top corners. And you can see what it's done. It's created a kind of squared off diagonal corner there instead of being rounded. I'm going to zoom out so I can see the entire object here. And I want to change the bottom two corners. I want to change the radius on that to 0 so that we just have a square bottom and that kind of chamfered top. So I'll just select that object, and in the transform panel, I'll make sure that I'm not constraining all four corners, and I'll change the corner radius on both the left and right bottom corners to 0. And now we can see how that has squared off the bottom corners. I'll close that panel, and I'll open up my swatches panel, and I'll change the fill color. to something like a brown. Make sure my fill icon is forward in the swatches panel and just change it to some brown corner. So there's the second part of our project.